Hi everyone, my name is Mark McGill. I'm from the University of Glasgow, and I'll be talking about our paper Expanding the Bounds of Seated Virtual Workspaces, which was published at Tokai but presented here at UIST. So, this is my desk at work, back when we were still able to go outside and travel to our workplaces, and here I have multiple large displays in different orientations, as well as multiple devices and peripherals, all to enable me to multitask more effectively. However, this kind of display space does have some problems. So it presents a physical barrier to the world. It prevents me from interacting with others in the office particularly easily. These displays aren't easily adjustable. I am sorely limited to how many physical displays I can actually have. They're ergonomically problematic, so they're difficult to position or reposition, and they don't translate well to mobile usage. So I'm particularly limited to when I'm on the laptop, for example. However, we are approaching a point where we will become less reliant on physical displays. So the future has now finally caught up with us, and we have VR and AR headsets that are sufficiently capable of virtual displays that are both wide and legible for the first time. And there have been numerous examples of this in virtual reality, for example, with big screen, multi-screens, space, virtual desktops, and Facebook's recent Infinite Office video in particular. And in augmented reality, multiple projects have used devices like the Microsoft HoloLens to render virtual displays and content in mixed reality, for better or worse depending in this particular case. I leave that to be determined. Now, the benefits of virtual displays are that fundamentally we can manipulate the virtual displays or apps in ways that are difficult to impossible to do with physical displays. The question then is, what manipulations are worthwhile? So are we going to manipulate virtual displays in terms of improving usability or ergonomics or the efficiency or so on? And there are a number of factors we can now trivially manipulate with a virtual display. For example, its size, shape or orientation, the depth of the display and the content on the display, whether the concept of a display that contains apps is even necessary, given we can have freestanding application windows that can be docked or placed around us. What kinds of constraints or rules should apply to virtual display placement, for example, placing them eccentrically in our world based on the visual saliency of our surroundings. And even the number of display or display elements that we have available. There are no longer any meaningful restrictions on what we choose to call our workspace. Now, our focus is particularly on the ergonomics of wide virtual workspaces. So we can render multiple displays around us, going up to and beyond what we might typically do in a physical workspace. Multiple displays benefit sense-making and awareness and enable spatial partitioning of subtasks and greater information density and availability. However, wide virtual workspaces may lead to excessive head or neck movement, with content not easily or comfortably reachable. This can lead to an increase of musculoskeletal disorders, so it might cause harm if we use such display spaces every day for hours at a time. But crucially, some head motion is required. So there's been research that has shown that dual monitor setups, for example, leads to less musculoskeletal disorders than single monitors because of the variety of neck and head movement involved. So our focus was on, well, can we improve the usability of these wide virtual workspaces? And our approach was to use counter rotation of displays around a pivot point. So imagine we have an XR user, which is where the black circle is positioned, approximately at the pivot point where these displays are centered around. And we exploit implicit inputs, so head orientation, for example, to enact counter rotations of these displays, e.g. through rotational gain or other mappings of head or orientation to display position. But the end result is effectively that based on head movement, we counter-rotate these displays so that the user can access a wider display space in a narrower range of head motion. So, across two studies, we explore how we can beneficially alter the mapping between head orientation and display position, and whether implicit control of display position is preferable to explicit user control and no control at all. In our first study, where we are manipulating the mapping between head rotation and workspace position, we had two factors that we were looking at. Firstly, the number of displays. So here we have 5 displays in the picture, and we were varying between 3 and 5 displays. Each display encompassed 60 degrees range around this pivot point. So in effect, the 3 displays would take up 180 degrees of the user's vision, and the 5 displays would take up 300 degrees around the user's vision. The other factor we were looking at was the mapping between the head orientation and the display position. We had a control condition, no mapping at all. Then we had a constant assistance condition, which was essentially a constant 2 times counter-rotational gain. We had a central dead zone condition, which was a fixed central display with a 12.5 degree dead zone and dynamic counter-rotational gain as you left that dead zone. And then finally, we had the all displays have dead zones condition, where the center of every display was a dead zone, and when you moved between displays, a rapid transition would occur that would counter-rotate the display. If this all sounds fairly confusing, I have some video here that hopefully explains it a bit more sensibly than I can. So here you can see that the user is looking minus 60 degrees in reality, and then back to 0 degrees in reality. And you can see that the displays were counter-rotating based on rotational gain. Here, we've got the central dead zone condition. Again, the user looks to minus 60 and 0, and then plus 60, and you can see that the displays are counter-rotating in, so that the user is effectively looking at double the range of normal motion. And here we can see the all displays of dead zones, so when you're looking at the center of the display, there's no movement, and when you cross the boundary to the next display, the display moves into place. In this way, the users could reach a much wider virtual workspace with a very limited envelope of head movement. So we ran a study with 16 users watching a documentary whilst performing a targeting task. Neck fatigue, workload, simulator sickness, discomfort and performance were all captured. And we've got some examples from the 5 display condition of the targeting task as follows here. So users were watching a nature documentary. They would occasionally be prompted to look at a new target. And then once the target disappeared, they would continue to watch the nature documentary until the new target appeared, and then they were prompted to transition back. In this way, we motivated transitions across the width of the display space, whilst giving them something to cognitively attend to in the form of the documentary. Now, we had a lot of measures here, but the very quick summary is that there was a minimal impact on accuracy in terms of targeting. However, counter-rotations made viewing the peripheral displays significantly more comfortable, particularly compared to the absence of any assistance in viewing. And counter-rotations were broadly preferred, so particularly the instant transitions based on the display boundaries, and particularly for 3 displays over 5 displays. So our instant transitions based on gaze allowed users to have the amount of head or neck movement required to access the peripheral displays, leading to improvements in terms of the amount of body movement, neck fatigue, discomfort, and performance and selection time. However, interview feedback suggested that these transition movements were at times too abrupt, and that the size of the dead zones may have not been large enough. There was also the question of whether implicit control of this counter-rotation based on head and neck movement was preferable over explicit control. So, for example, hitting a key press to rotate the displays as and when necessary. And there was also the issue of, well, this task wasn't particularly ecologically valid. It was a rather artificial targeting task, so would this apply to a real workspace? This led to our second study, which was implicit versus explicit control of the workspace. So here we were looking for greater ecological validity, so a real functional workspace with a real productivity task. We wanted to iterate on our boundary switching mechanism, which was the most preferred from our previous study, and we wanted to explore the utility of implicit versus explicit control over the display position. So for study 2, we iterated upon the best assistance technique from study 1, and we implemented a fully functional virtual workspace with 3 virtual Windows desktops, as well as a positionally tracked keyboard and mouse allowing for equivalent interactivity to a standard non-VR workspace. And this was using the Logitech mixed reality keyboard for text entry and an Apple trackpad attached to the side of it. So participants performed a holiday planning task. They were motivated to use the full use of the virtual workspace through this task. We had 3 conditions. The first condition was the control condition where the displays were fixed in place. The second condition gave users keyboard shortcuts that would allow them to counter-rotate the displays based on their inputs. And then the third condition was an iteration on the best ranked technique from study 1. So this allowed for implicit control of the display position based on looking left or right and crossing the display boundaries. Now, again, I'll just cover some brief highlights in the results. Broadly, users had a perception that their performance was maximized in the boundary condition, that is, when they were moving their head and when their gaze crossed the boundaries, these displays counter-rotated around. And that condition was preferred by about 2/3 of the users in this study. For the explicit control, which is the middle column in this graph, we can see here that users use this function for approximately 35% of all display transitions. So this reaffirms prior research that questions the uptake of these kinds of explicit controls over display action. So for 65% of the time, users would still rely on manually looking at the peripheral displays despite the potential discomfort, compared to the boundary condition where they were forced to use this assistance technique. So over 2 studies, we demonstrated the utility of dynamically manipulating the display position based on head and neck movement. Wide display spaces were made more comfortable and more accessible to users, allowing their use within a comfortable ergonomic envelope of neck movement. And virtual displays gave us an opportunity not just to present more content, but to present it in a way that also better took into account the ergonomics and the ability and range of motion of an individual and adapt to changes in their context, their posture and position, potentially. Now, there's lots of future work here, so we could imagine refinements to our boundary switching technique. So, for example, occasionally false positive transitions happened. We imagine if we used eye gaze rather than head orientation, we could resolve that. Cursor management approaches. So if you have wide and super wide virtual workspaces, it can become much easier to lose track of where your cursor is. We had a crude mechanism for relocating the cursor based on a gesture on the trackpad, but we can imagine better solutions there. We could also imagine alternative display arrangements and anchor points. So we looked only at horizontal curved displays of fixed sizes, but work by others has hypothesized that many different configurations might also be preferable. So for example, having a vertical arrangement or a stack of displays. And we can imagine other applications of manipulating display to body mappings. So for example, imagine a wrist-based augmented reality display where the wrist rotation dictates which display is currently centered on the wrist for touch interaction. And we can imagine use in confined spaces. So can we further improve the usability of virtual display spaces in a confined environment like a plane, for example, where we have very limited ranges of head or neck movement because of passengers next to us and because of the seating that we're in? Can we maximize our capability to access these wide virtual workspaces despite the confinement that we're in? These and many challenges I would look forward to seeing more research on. So that was our Tokai paper on expanding the bounds of seated virtual workspaces presented at UIST 2020. Thank you very much.